My name is Dorothy Paugh. I'm retired from the Navy, and I work to prevent as many suicides as possible. Most of all, what I work for is for people to be aware that having a loaded gun triples the risk of suicide to everyone who can get a hold of it. The primary reason that most people buy a gun today is for protection. And what they may not know is that the statistics don't bear that out. It actually introduces a threefold risk of suicide to everyone in the home. I do think a lot of parents, especially if they have young children like toddlers, they do realize that it's not safe for a gun to be within their reach. But what they think is that if they've given an older child safety training on a gun so that they know how to handle it safely, they think that that child will no longer be in danger from the gun. And as kids get older and they get to be adolescents, which is a time of great angst, what happens is a child intends to harm themselves. So at that point, safety training backfires.
Right.
Because now they have familiarity with the gun as well as access. I came to the suicide prevention advocacy in the worst possible way. And that is first as a small child. I was 9 years old, and it was a hot August day, and my dad had asked my mom to take all of us, there were 5 of us kids, to take us to the swimming pool, which was a treat for us. We didn't get to go that often. So I was splashing around and playing Marco Polo with my brothers and sisters and having the best time. And my mother's name came on the loudspeaker, and actually a policeman drove the vehicle, our station wagon, because he didn't want my mother to drive. And they took us to the hospital, and there they told us that my dad had died. And they didn't at that age tell me that he had shot himself. And in fact, over the years, it was never spoken of because there was such stigma for him having taken his own life.
Right. And also stigma against mental illness. Like there's still mental illness stigma,
right?
But it's not as bad as it used to be. There used to be very much this sense of therapy is only for the weak, emotions make you weak. There were no resources to help people process trauma. There's no understanding that that trauma wasn't just considered being a war refugee. You could have trauma just from an ordinary kind of family life that's dysfunctional. When did you learn that he had taken his life by gun and died by suicide, a victim of suicide? When did you learn that, and what was your reaction?
Yeah, I don't really recall when I learned. I guess I do. Actually, on the playground, now that I think of it, there at the schoolyard, one of the boys yelled at me, "We know how your father died. He killed himself." It wasn't something that even in our family, in fact, when my younger brother, he was only 5 at the time, he didn't know till he was in his 30s. That's how much we didn't talk about it. And we all just sort of thought, well, didn't you know? How did you not know? But then we realized, well, we never really talked about it. But so that's one reason, and again, what you were saying about the stigma of appearing weak or asking for help, I honestly believe that played into my next experience with suicide. And that was in 2012, when I was at work and my phone rang, and it was a Baltimore County police officer, and he asked me if I was Peter's mother, and I said yes. And he said, well, there's been an he started to say accident, and then he said incident. And he said, why would he do this? And I said, do what? And he said, shoot himself.
Oh God.
So yeah, Peter was very smart. I'm sure he knew that there were resources, that he could have asked any one of us, family, friends. He had a longtime girlfriend.
How old was he?
He was 25, and he knew that there were resources, but I think the stigma, the not wanting to ask for help, not wanting to appear weak. He wanted to help everyone else. He wanted to take care. In fact, his note to me asked me to take care of his girlfriend and how she would be, devastated, and to take her and treat her like my daughter.
Oh.
So, he had a heart for other people. He had a heart for animals and the environment, and he just didn't have enough heart. He ran out of steam for himself. He needed to find a way to cope with his emotions and his frustrations and his despair. And I don't think we give men those lessons, boys those lessons growing up. And so I wanted, especially when my first grandchild was born, a boy, I wanted to ask my son and his wife, let boys cry, let him cry, because they mask so much pain. And I think that's the price that men pay for the stiff, rigid gender roles, that doesn't let them express their feelings and doesn't tell them how to cope with anger. Anger isn't a bad emotion.
It's like one of the emotions. So how do you process it? How do you, in a healthy way, how do you self-regulate? Sometimes something that I've learned having two boys is that sometimes whatever the feeling is, if it's anger or shame or sadness or a feeling of jealousy, that sometimes that feeling feels so big that it's too big for their bodies. And so then how do they get it out of their body? And so then that could be hitting, it could be self-harm, it could be all sorts of things. If they don't have the ability to, one, be aware maybe that they're getting that out of control, or two, taking a step and breathing, or doing a mindful exercise where you start counting trees or leaves or something that kind of brings you back in the moment. So you're not kind of in your head freaking out. But yeah, that there aren't though. I mean, it's what motivated me to start Build Up Boys. They're just not trained to do that, and there's still this stigma. And a lot of it comes from misogyny and homophobia, that anything that's considered girly, like emotions, somehow got relegated to girls and women, but it's a human thing. I do have a question about why did he have a gun? And did you know about his emotional struggles? Because you're saying that he was, very integrated into relationship and connection, that it seemed like he was a caretaker, he had a solid relationship. Often when we think of boys committing suicide or using guns to kill or whatever it is, there's a feeling of real isolation. It sounds extreme, but it seems like that was not the case.
Yeah, no, he was not a loner. And he bought a gun after his older brother bought a gun, and he bought his gun for two reasons. Protection was one of them, but also just recreation, just target shooting. In fact, my husband and I went with him, all of us, to the range just one time, and that's what we did, was just shoot at paper.
What was
Um,
that like for you, given that your father?
yeah, I did talk to him. I said, it does make me nervous, because I know the risks. I know that our family history introduced a risk. There's a higher chance, um, having had a family member, or even someone you admire, commit suicide or take their life. Um, but even without any family history, access to a gun triples the risk. So I knew that those two, compounded, and I said to him, that I just, want you to be aware of that. And he was an adult, and at that point, all I could do was warn him. I felt like forewarned is forearmed. And I did not know that he was in the depths of a struggle. I did not know he was so emotionally, distressed. The last time we were together as a family, it was, at a restaurant near his home, and it was a family dinner, and it just coincidentally, I had just gotten a pay raise, and his older brother had just gotten a promotion, and his younger brother, um, was also, making more money. They're both engineers, and he made a comment that, um, that he made so much less. He worked in environmental science. And in thinking about it, I just felt horrible that, who measures their value by their salary? I mean,
A lot of people
people,
in this country. I mean, that's
yeah,
the craziest thing, that
yeah,
somehow, as a culture, there's this value and worth defined on externals, whether that be what you look like, whether that be your job, whether you're married, whether you're not married, if you have kids, if you don't have kids. There are all these like ways in which people define their worth, and it
yeah,
really has nothing to do with your worth,
yeah,
So
yeah,
I do think that that's kind of, that he's a victim to the culture, the cultural pressure
yeah,
of that.
yeah.
Um, did his girlfriend ever share with you that that was something going on with him, that
Um,
he?
no, no, I know that, he had a good job. He wasn't, um, hurting for cash. In fact, I used to call him my little accountant, because I would try to give him money and he would say, "No, mom, I won't, I don't need it. I won't take it." This is as a teenager. I'm like, what child does that? Like,
Right, kids are usually like taking money from their parents' wallet.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we would go to the grocery store, and this was when he was younger, and the other two would be putting things in my cart, like, foodie cereal, sugar cereal and candy and cookies. And he would be taking things out and say, "Mom, we don't need this. We don't need this." And I'd say, "Yes, yes, we do." Occasionally I'm like,
You're like,
but I
that would
used
be
to,
great.
I
Yeah.
would tease him. But it's never just one thing that makes a suicide understandable. I mean, there's always more than one thing. It's just like, it's it just gets to be the straw that broke the camel's back. And with my father too, um, he had pointed out to my mom, she knew that he was gonna, um, he told her he planned to kill himself. And he said, "Here's my will, you'll get a VA pension as a survivor, and this policy should pay, um, for life insurance." And so she called our priest, and she called his best friend, and they both came to the house, and they talked to him at two different times at length. And, when they left, felt like, everything was fine. And but what neither of them did was say, hey, can I hold that gun for you? Can I take that? He had just bought it. He bought it for one use. And so that's what got me involved with, I started reading. I said, suicide has kicked my ass twice, and now I'm going to kick its ass.
I like that. You're like, it's going down.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that's when I just read everything I could get my hands on what works, because it's a complex issue. And what I found the more I read was that, there's two things that have worked to reduce suicides, and that's talk therapy, and also removing the most lethal method in the United States. And far and away, because of how effective a gun is, it's the most lethal common method, because so few survive. Like more than 3 times as many men die by suicide. Most of them use a gun. 3 times as many women attempt, or females will attempt suicide. But they tend to use less lethal methods. Pills, for example, only 4% of people that take pills die, because there's time for intervention for them to either change their mind, get help, or the medical care can save them, but not true of a gun.
Right. Do you think, going back to the idea of gender pressure and the kind of breakdown in how boys are socialized and how girls are socialized, and the kind of different risks and problems, do you think there's something to be said, not just about the rate, the effectiveness, like the efficacy of a gun in terms of making sure it happens, but do you think that there is something related to the violence of it?
Well, for one, I think that girls and women, it's more acceptable for them to ask for help. And appearing weak, is not something that, shatters our identity or view of ourselves, or appearing helpless. I mean, in fact, that's some of the, culture, the woman always needs to be saved. We're sort of,
It's not just
socialized towards accepting help.
Right. So it's not just acceptable, it's sometimes expected. And so within that, there's more permission. And
Right.
Boys and men do not have that permission.
Right. Yes. A man, just, saying, I don't know what to do, I can't go on. It's not respectable. And what I hope to get across is that we can't expect someone in a suicidal crisis to be the one to ask for help. Those of us around that person need to get comfortable enough to ask the question, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Because they could be so overwhelmed and not thinking clearly, that especially men, they tend not to reach out. They're also the ones who tend not to go to get counseling or go to a therapist. So they're the population most likely to use the most lethal method, and the population least likely to get help in any other way, to go to counseling. Everyone who loses someone to suicide spends years agonizing over every moment in the course of their lives that they might have said or done something differently to change the outcome. But
Right. Like you could look back at that dinner and say, oh, well, what if we didn't talk about money, or that joke wasn't made? Would that have made a difference? And it might have, and it might not have, but there's still that kind of tendency. Yes.
Yeah. yeah, yeah. I I would just ask that when a boy is hurting, that we don't say, put on your big boy pants, or um, and have them stifle so much of their emotions. And then, when there is an act of aggression, we have to respond to that, with, finding out what they were feeling and how they could have done that, handled that differently, and what the consequences were, for those around them. So yeah, it's just, and it's talking about things that may be scary, or uncomfortable. In society, we have a real Pollyanna, approach, and they say that social media has exacerbated that everyone else is, beautiful and happy and, um, rich. And so again, just handling things that are real, and it's everything from, violence to, death, all the subjects that we avoid and, don't necessarily want to share because they're they can be frightening. And because I think that, psychologically, when something frightens us, what we want to know, I think most people want to know enough about suicide to conclude that it'll never happen to anyone they care about. And that's wrong. That's wrong.
Tell me why that's wrong.
Because it can happen to people around you that you would never in a million years imagine would take their lives. You always hear, you know, well, they were rich, they
Like Kate Spade or
exactly. People that are struggling and suffering are very good at hiding it. They're very good at, keeping it to themselves, because if people recoil around you when you say something, unpleasant, then you learn quickly not to say it.
right. And then that's where the source of shame comes. From what I
Exactly.
understand, the difference of shame and guilt. Someone said this so beautifully once, that guilt is when you think you did something that's going to make someone mad at you. And shame is something that you think you are that makes you unlovable.
Yeah.
And so the deeper
Beautiful.
your shame is, to feel like, well, if I admit that I'm struggling, or if I admit that I have these dark thoughts, or if I admit that I'm not perfect, or whatever it is, then I will lose love. And that's, love is
Yeah.
how we survive, because we're
Yeah.
social creatures. Then it does shove that stuff into secrecy. I
Yeah.
think the connection between shame and secrecy is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing I wonder is, let's say, my dad's best friend had asked for his gun, and he instead had left an example, a legacy for our family of a man getting help, that perhaps my son would have still be here.
Right.
So, because it has to be not only just okay, it has to be respectable and even admirable for someone to say they're hurting, they need help. And that especially boys, because I think they're stunted early on not to say anything. After I did all that reading, I found out that there are laws, to remove firearms from people who are a danger, not just to others, but possibly to themselves. Like for the most of the country, you can get a protective order if someone threatens someone else and remove firearms. But only in the past 20 some years has there been any state that had an order if you threaten to harm yourself. It
Oh,
was
wow.
so, and actually Connecticut had risk warrant laws that allowed removal of firearms. So I did the reading, and I went to my state delegate in Maryland, and Geraldine Valentino Smith. I had just sent her an email. I'm nobody special. I sent her an email and I told her my story, and I said, I've done this research and here are just a couple, links to more information. And she called me back and she said, I want to help you. And that's never happened. And so for that year, it was not enough time to pull it all together. So the following year.
And what year is this now?
So that was, I approached her in 2017. Our state legislature meets from like January to the beginning of April. And I had approached her in the fall. So she said, can we do this next year? So I'm sure. So that she said that we could build some coalition of support and draft what we need. And so when the next year came around, several different groups that we approached said they had other priorities, or, we had some experts who work in the field tell us that it's an election year, and since it's controversial, it involves guns, not to do it this year. So in the meantime, I had a health scare, and I thought, well, I might not be here in another year. And it was like, I just felt I have to try. I just felt compelled. I said, all I know is I have to try. After that, it's out of my hands. And my delegate, even though people actually lobbied her not to put the bill forward, she looked at me and said, I made a promise. And she filed this, they were sometimes called red flag laws. The mental health community prefers, and I use extreme risk protection laws. And it was filed in January for 2018. And in February, Parkland, the shooting at the high school happened. And then right after that, there was a high school girl in Southern Maryland shot and killed by a boy. And our governor, who was a Republican, said, I want that red flag law to pass.
Wow.
And once there was his leadership, bipartisan support, everybody came to the table and they worked out a bill. And in its first 2 years, it took effect October of 2018. Since then, well over 1,000 petitions have been granted by judges to temporarily remove firearms of someone.
Wow.
So it's like my proudest
Wow.
accomplishment. And there is research that, for every, 10 to 20 orders granted, a life is saved. So a suicide could be prevented. So the data and the research needs to go forward. But if you can just, any obstacle or delay gives a person in a suicidal crisis time, because they're the overriding aim is to end the pain. So it's not to die. So given time, rather than finding another way to die, because that's what they say, oh, if you take away the gun, they'll do something else. But
even if they do, that something else might not be as effective. And then
Exactly.
that buys you time. Like you've heard about people who've survived the Golden Gate
Right.
Bridge, and somewhere like halfway down or whatever it is, there's a kind of regret that happens.
Yeah.
And you don't get a chance to have that, or have like a second, chance.
Right. So instead of finding another way to die, most people who survive a suicide attempt find a way to live. So there needs to be an understanding, just as a in the general public's mind, that ownership of a gun, it of course confers responsibility, and it introduces this risk. So I think people just need to be aware, because even without a law, because right now I think it's 19 states have an extreme risk protection law. Even without a law, if people around the person are aware, they can ask voluntarily, can I hold that gun for you? If they just understood the risk, if they know someone's struggling. Now, granted, you don't always know.
Right.
But if you suspect, you can ask, and you can always call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline for guidance. You don't have to be the one considering suicide. You can do it because you care about someone else. I once saw a TED Talk by a doctor from Colorado, Emmy Betts, and she said she was a suicide prevention researcher, and she said that she would go to dinner parties and she'd say, suicide isn't normally the topic of conversation at a cocktail party.
No.
And then she stopped and said, but maybe it should be. And I thought that was wonderful, because it's like, we need to, everyone needs to be able to talk about it. And by talking about it and not joking about it, I remember being in, one of the first work meetings I was in when I went back to work, I was, barely functional for probably a year after my son's suicide. But I'm in a meeting and someone says that, the presenter says, oh, I've been so stressed. I've, so much to do. I'm going to shoot myself. And I was like,
are you fucking kidding me? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I was in an elevator and my coworkers are around me and said, yeah, they were laughing and joking. They said, something about, how they should kill themselves, or how, and I didn't say anything, but, I just wanted to, say, well, use a gun. That's what my son did,
Oh my God. Talk about stopping someone in their tracks. They'd be like, oh.
Yeah. But, we need to talk about it, but we need to talk about it in a way that respects the people that are, suffering.
Yes. And also, I'm even just thinking about, I know some people who even use the hand motion of a gun to their head if they're bored, or if they think something's ridiculous, or whatever it is. And so, to your point, there's this unconscious way that we talk about things that are uncomfortable, that hurts us, not hurts us just as people, but as a society. And I think it's the same with things like, oh, well, grow a pair, right? Like, something as casual as that could seem really
Yeah.
innocuous, but then it becomes something that someone around you is internalizing, feeling like,
Yeah.
oh, well, then it is weak for me
Yeah.
to have these feelings or to not know what's happening or whatever it is. So I have noticed that there's a lot in our behavior and language, even as something like saying to a boy or a girl, if they fall down and cry or hurt themselves, to be like, you're okay, you're okay. You know,
Yeah.
like that doesn't seem so awful to say. Like you're trying to say to the person, you're okay, you're not going to die, or you're okay, you don't have a broken leg or whatever, but it is invalidating that experience to tell
Yeah.
someone they're okay. And
Yeah.
so to your
Yeah.
point, I think that being more aware and more conscious of
Yeah.
what we say, what we do, who we say it
Yeah.
around, and that takes some humility. It
Yeah.
takes, it's like kind of race conversations. A lot of
Yeah.
people don't want to have race conversations because they don't
Yeah.
want to say the wrong thing. But how are you going to be able to get to some better place if you don't try? As you
Yeah.
said, like, I'm just going to try.
There's one line in the note my son left before he took his life, and he said, "Something is wrong with me." And I want to say something is wrong with most of us. Almost everyone,
Yes.
has something wrong with them.
Yes.
Most of us are walking around
Yes.
flawed.
Yes.
Um,
Deeply flawed. We're all
yeah,
deeply flawed. Yes.
yeah. So I just wish he had known that, that um, that good um, can happen over the horizon. Like at my age, I've lived long enough to know that things can change and things can get better. Like,
Right.
and when you're younger, you don't always have that perspective, and you think, I can't keep doing this, forever. It's too painful.
And it's too debilitating, especially if you're holding it all. And that goes back to the being able to expel it, express it, connect with others over it, that we're not meant to hold our pain and our suffering just to ourselves. It's too much for any one person to handle by themselves. Like, I think we really, really need each other.
Yeah,
And so that goes back to the permission to admit when something's not right. Or even if he could have said to several people, like, I feel like something's wrong with me. And then what conversation would have that prompted,
yeah.
versus not having the conversation, but just having that statement.
It's National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, which is a mouthful, but I think the mental health people wanted it to be awareness as well as prevention, um, in part as a nod to those survivors who did their best and weren't able to prevent.
Yes.
So not every suicide could be prevented, but we don't know which ones we can and which ones we can't. So let's try to prevent all of them.
Yes. Amen.